Hey YouTube, this is Lydia with Sweet King's Garden, and thanks for tuning back in. Today we are talking all about sourdough bread. I have my starter that has been sitting out since yesterday. I need to discard, feed it, and I have 3 loaves of sourdough bread that I needed to make this weekend, so I figured why not take you all along. So I'm gonna break this down very simple for you all, and be sure to link all of the references that I've used to actually learn how to make sourdough bread. My biggest point to convey is not to be overwhelmed or scared. I hope that by the end of this video you can see that, hey, this is something that perhaps you can try making yourself as well. But I know that just the sound of making your own sourdough bread may be a bit scary, and I'm hoping to alleviate some concerns. So with that, let me show you what I have. First and most vital item for sourdough bread is a starter. So I have this starter that I started early December, and I have a tag of when I first put this in this mason jar here, and then I also wrote instructions for myself, so a feeding schedule. It's been a fun experiment because when I first started making sourdough bread, I was not sure I was going to be successful, and I also did not know how long I'd be able to keep this up for. So it's now March 11th, and the first date that I have on here is December 5th. That's after my starter was actually established. A week prior to that, I was actually making the starter, and that was a bit of a process, which I'll link that recipe and instructions in the link below. But this is critical, absolutely critical. You may be thinking, Lydia, how did you even start making sourdough bread? It all started with a gigantic bag of flour from Costco. This was, of course, back in like November, December. I really wanted to start making a bunch of holiday cookies. I began to host a holiday cookie swap with my girlfriends, and my husband was at Costco, and I said, can you please get me a bag of white flour? And this is the bag that he came home with, and it was 25 pounds of flour. So this was just chilling on my countertop for a few weeks. I actually ended up not making a single batch of cookies last year because then my husband ended up getting sick, and my cookie swap then turned into like just a girls' night. I was staring at it every single day, and I was like, you know what? I think I'm gonna try and make bread for the very first time. So of course I went to YouTube because I find YouTube is just a phenomenal resource now. And I found a 2-part series from Chef Billy Parisi, which of course I'll link the videos down below. There was one video that talked about how to actually establish and make your own starter without any yeast whatsoever. And then the second was how to make sourdough bread. So I referenced the second video now that I have my starter established. I'll hopefully never have to make it again, but I have the second video that I reference from time to time. This has been really exciting, and just like it warms my heart because I feel like I'm able to share this with friends of mine that are interested and ready to take the plunge in making their own sourdough bread. As I've discarded, which I'll show you in just a moment, it gives you an opportunity to actually share your starter with friends and family. I've shared this starter with 3 friends and family members already. Him and I continue to swap recipes that we find and whatnot. So we've been making all different kinds of things with their sourdough bread starter. It's important to note, sourdough bread is a process. I'm feeding my starter today, but I actually took my starter out of my refrigerator yesterday. So today's technically day 2 of the process. I'm going to feed it, let it hang out for an entire day. Then tomorrow, which will be day 3, is when I can start adding ingredients and actually making the 3 separate loaves of bread. Then they all have to hang out in the fridge overnight. And then on Sunday, March 13th, I will actually be able to bake the bread. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4-day process. So do not let that part discourage you. As long as you are aware of the action items that you'll need to take on each day, no problem at all. But my biggest advice is to just identify what those action items are so you know what to expect and you can plan accordingly. I've been caught many times staying up until like 3 a.m. making my bread just because I started the process too late in the day, and it's not something that you can just stop and say, I'm tired, I'll have to pick this up tomorrow. You definitely need to be diligent in following the instructions. So that is my word of advice to you. And maybe you'll just have to experience those super late nights, but then you'll remember. Ingredient number 1, I have my sourdough bread starter. This is what I'm going to discard and feed. Then I have all-purpose flour. Then I have organic white whole wheat flour. You will need filtered water. Important, do not use tap water. Do not use anything that may have chlorine because it will kill your starter. So I filled up this glass measuring cup with filtered water from my refrigerator. You will need to heat this up to a specified temperature, and for that I have a digital thermometer. Definitely make sure you have that. Then I'll have a smaller container, which is a mason jar is what I use, for the discard. The feeding schedule requires you to throw away a good portion of your starter in order to keep it alive. Well, that kind of hurts my heart because I look at the discard as waste that perhaps I can use into something else. So I've found a lot of discard recipes where you can use the sourdough discard into making things like bagels and such. And then lastly, a scale. So we will be following a lot of measurements in grams, so make sure whatever scale you have, hopefully it's digital, that would be preferred, because you do want to try and stick to exact measurements. And I personally have a scale that I can just toggle between different units and whatnot. Let's get right into it because this is actually very easy and it moves pretty quick. So with my sourdough bread instructions here, I have my feed schedule. So it says discard all but 37.5 grams of starter. So I'm gonna take everything but 37.5 grams from here. I'm actually going to spoon out the 37.5 grams into this bowl and then scoop everything else that remains in this jar and put that in my smaller discard jar. Let me just show you so you have a visual of what 37.5 grams look like. It's not much at all. So as you can see, we have all of that goodness that otherwise would be just tossed in the trash, and we're not doing that because this is a key ingredient for our sourdough bagels. Now, the sourdough bread bagels I did make previously when I was finishing my microgreen journey video, so I will be sure to link that above here so you can happily reference that and see what that recipe looks like. And the recipe is included in that description. I'll go ahead and include that bagel recipe in this description as well, just so you have everything in one place. So for now, I am discarding the rest of the sourdough bread contents. So this is all of the starter that otherwise would be trashed. So now I have a fairly empty jar of my sourdough bread starter. I'm now going to add the 37.5 grams of starter back to that jar. I am going to rinse this bowl out right away. Sourdough bread discard or starter is like concrete if you let it sit too long. So I am going to make sure I rinse all of this stuff because I don't want to set myself up for frustration later when I'm doing dishes and I have to chisel this stuff out of the bowl. The next step to the process says to add 120 grams of white all-purpose flour and then 30 grams of the whole wheat flour. Now, next on my list, it says add in 120 grams of water that is between 90 to 92 degrees Fahrenheit. So I've already tested, I'm within that range. So I'm gonna zero out my scale again, and I am going to carefully add 120 grams of water. And now all we have to do is mix. Now you want to make sure you mix this very, very thoroughly. I'm also scraping the sides really good. I don't want there to be any dry pockets of flour. Okay, so that was easy enough, right? Not scary at all, especially when you have your starter already established, which you can purchase, or if you have a friend that's into sourdough bread making, This is when I typically, if I know that I'm gifting some sourdough starter to someone, this discard is what I would gift them. What I would do is then grab another mason jar and put 37.5 grams of my discard in a new jar, and then add the whole wheat flour, add the all-purpose flour, add the water, mix it up so that they receive the end result just like this. So where we go from here, so you're gonna carefully put your lid back onto your starter. And this is where you want to make sure you put this in a nice cozy spot. My husband and I have a pellet stove. I found a nice cozy spot for this to hang out was right on top of the pellet stove. If you don't have a pellet stove, you can place this on your counter, on top of a heat mat, or I find that you can also just pop this in your oven with the oven door cracked. So now you see my hiding spot for all of my cast iron skillet pots. So I'm going to put my sourdough starter on this shelf. I am going to crack my oven door so that the light remains on. My sourdough bread starter, freshly fed, is going to hang out there for 24 hours. Tomorrow, which will be day 3, is when I'll start adding additional flour and water, some salt, and I'm going to make the 3 loaves of bread. So I'll check in with you all then. And welcome back to day 3. As you can see, it's looking pretty nice and fluffy just from looking on the outside of the jar. Yesterday, this actually grew after I fed it to the very top of this mason jar and then has started to shrink down. So now is the perfect time for us to start our autolyse process. Now, from here forward, this is where I'm referencing the Billy Parisi sourdough bread recipe video. So I fed my starter, I let it start to shrink, and now I'm going to start the autolyse process. So this is where you can kind of take from here on out on the video and just follow those instructions accordingly. I'm making 3 different loaves of sourdough bread, so I'm essentially tripling this recipe. I have more than enough starter that is fed to be able to add to these 3 loaves. I knew ahead of time yesterday that I needed to obviously feed and let this starter hang out for 24 hours. This morning when I woke up, I knew I had a lot of things going on. I had a workout class, I had to meet a friend for lunch, so I did not start this process that we're starting now earlier this morning, because once you kind of start that domino, it's just going to continue. So I'm picking up where I know that I can dedicate the next couple of hours to kind of babysit and maintain the next couple of steps through this process. So I am going to measure out my flours. So again, I have all-purpose flour, and then I have whole wheat flour. I'm gonna add them in addition to my water, and I'm essentially adding 1 batch per loaf of bread. I'm gonna put a time lapse here so you don't have to watch me measure out everything. I want to make sure I'm mixing this water when it's at the appropriate temperature. After I've added the water to each batch, I'm going to mix at this time. So I've just added the 275 grams of water to the first batch of bread, and I am just going to make these folds. And again, you can follow the technique from the Billy Parisi video, but I just want to make sure that all of this is nice and incorporated. So we've gotten this to a really nice spot. It's very sticky, very thick. I'm going to cover this, and we're going to start the autolyse process for 30 minutes. Okay, so 30 minutes is up. I now have the autolyse process complete. So now we're ready to add the starter to each loaf of bread. I want to show you what a freshly fed starter looks like. So once you start making your own sourdough bread, when you see freshly fed starter dough, you're gonna be like, oh my gosh, this is gorgeous. So you can see the bubbles and air all activated, and it's nice and stringy. So I'm super excited to add this. I'm just going to add 75 grams to the top of each one of these. I've just prepared 3 loaves of sourdough bread using this starter recipe that requires the 120 grams of white all-purpose flour, 30 grams of whole wheat flour, and then that water. I still have just enough starter just to keep this alive and continue things. But as you can see, just with that one recipe where we've discarded and fed, I can make comfortably 3 loaves of sourdough bread. Now I'm going to start folding the starter into each of the loaves of bread, and then these are going to sit covered with a damp towel for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to do our first series of our folds. So this method of folding you can actually find from the Billy Parisi video. I am just stretching from the outside and folding the bread in the inside. Do not tear your bread. You want to eventually strengthen the gluten in your bread. It should only take maybe 1 circulation of folds around the entire bowl. And then what I like to do is just fold and kind of flip the entire loaf so that all of those folds that were on top are now at the bottom. And as you can see, it's still thick, but you're going to see as we progress through each of the folds, the composition of your bread's going to change. We're gonna let these loaves of bread sit in either your oven or, in my case, at the pellet stove, and then for 30 minutes. Then we're gonna come back and add the salt, and then we're gonna start performing our series of folds. 30 minutes is up, and now we are ready to add our salt. When I first started making sourdough bread, I only had kosher salt on hand, and that's what I used, and this loaf of bread turned out perfectly fine. Since that time, I purchased some sea salt. Now, I've heard that good quality sea salt will actually make a difference in the sourdough bread, and I have since preferred using this sea salt, and I just picked it up from a local grocery store. But keep in mind, make do with whatever you happen to have on hand. You're going to use 14 grams of sea salt per loaf of bread. Now what we're going to do is we're going to wet our fingertips, and we're going to work the salt nicely into the sourdough bread. Once you feel that the salt has been worked into the bread, then you're going to perform the same series of folds that you used during the last 30 minutes. And the water that I'm dipping my fingers in is actually filtered water from my refrigerator. So again, be conscious not to use tap water or anything that may contain chlorine, because you do not want to kill the natural yeast that's in your sourdough bread. Once you feel that you have enough of the salt mixed into your bread, take your dough and remove it from the sides of your bowl, and then start performing your folds. So again, pulling the outside, bringing it in towards the middle, and perform just enough series of rotations until you can feel it getting super tight. And then once you're comfortable with that, pick it up and then set it back in the bowl to where it looks nice and even. Once I finish with this, I'm gonna cover again with a damp cloth, and you can put this back in your oven, or in my case, I'm gonna set it right in front of my pellet stove for 1 full hour. Follow the series of folds. We're gonna catch you when we arrive at our last fold. Okay everyone, so we've officially finished all of our folds, and we are now ready to transfer the loaves of bread onto the countertops and sprinkle this. I'm going to use this bench knife. Now, I actually just purchased this a few weeks ago. Prior to using a bench knife for this next step, I was just using a regular spatula. It worked fine. I'm a big proponent of using what you have, so by all means, continue to use a spatula if that's all you have. But I have to say, this bench knife is just really nice for not only bread making, but just scooping up things as I'm cooking in the kitchen. So I am going to transfer this directly onto the countertop. You want to line your bowl with that damp cloth and sprinkle some flour there. So I'm going to set that aside. And now we're going to shape our dough. So I'm just putting some flour on the top and on the countertop just so that this doesn't stick. And I'm going to start shaping my dough. And what I'm doing is scooping and lifting to try and build the dough towards the center and make a little bit of height here. Gently stretch this into a rectangular log. I'm going to take the left side and fold it over about almost 2/3 of the way. And then I'm going to take the right side, stretch it just a little bit, and fold it over towards the left side. Now, it's a little on the drier side, and it's going to want to kind of pull back, but that's okay. So, keeping the rectangular shape in place, I'm now going to start from the bottom, and I'm going to pull towards me and start rolling. And once it's rolled, I'm going to pick it up so that the seam is facing up in the bowl. And now I'm going to use my fingers and I'm going to just try and pinch the seams together and try and create a seal. This may be a little more tricky if you do have a lot of flour on your bread because it's rather dry, but as you're pinching, you can feel the moisture in the dough. Okay, so this is what my dough looks like with the seams sealed together. What I'm now going to do is just drape my damp cloth over top, and I'm going to place this bowl in my refrigerator for overnight, so at least 12 hours. Good morning, everyone. Today is Sunday, March 13th. It's day 4 of making sourdough bread, and today is the day we will actually have bread. You will need is some kind of Dutch oven pot. I have a small cast iron skillet pot that I have in the oven. You want to preheat your oven for 500 degrees Fahrenheit and let that pot with the lid hang out in there, heating up for 30 minutes. After that 30 minutes, you want to then pull out your dough that has been sitting in the refrigerator overnight. I'm about to pull out this pot and add the dough to the pot, but I also have grits. Now, I think the recipe calls for some kind of cornmeal. What this does is you're going to sprinkle this in your pot, and it's going to prevent your bread from sticking to the pot. So I don't know if this is actually what you should be using, but this is what I've been using for all of my breads so far. Another item you are going to need is either a very sharp paring knife, or if you have a bread knife, which I think is called a lame, but it looks like this. It essentially has like a razor blade on the end. This is what you're going to use to score the top of your bread before it goes into the oven. I am going to pull my very hot pot out of the oven, and we're going to sprinkle the grits on the bottom of the pot, score our bread, and then bake it for 20 minutes. So you can see this is nice and hot. I am going to work very quickly here. Just give a nice sprinkle of grits on the bottom here. And then I'm going to quickly add the dough. Try to get it in the pot. And now I'm going to show you what I have here. So now I'm going to take my knife and I am going to score in a half circle, and this will create the ear that flips up on your sourdough bread. This is also at the point to where you can add decorative touches, so I'm just going to add a few more slits on the other side. So now we're going to cover the pot with the lid and put this in the oven for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, I am going to remove the lid and let that bake in the oven for 10 additional minutes. And then we're going to pull it out, transfer it to a cooling rack, and that's where it will remain for the rest of the day until it fully cools down. So I do want to just show you real quick what it looks like when you take the lid off your bread and let it bake for the additional 10 minutes. Okay, so hopefully you can see what that looks like. That is a loaf of sourdough bread. So this, my friends, is a loaf of sourdough bread. Now, I will say, I do notice an error. I did not score that half moon shape deep enough. This is actually supposed to create a more harsh lip, which it did not. So I will show you the difference. I'll be more intentional with scoring that on the next loaf of bread, but isn't that gorgeous? We are now done baking our sourdough bread, and I have the first, second, and third batch, and as you can see, they kind of got prettier as I went along. But this right here is the ear that I'm talking about. So I'm just gonna show you what the sourdough bread looks like after it is done. It is gorgeous, very versatile. I've made a ton of things with just one loaf of bread, and I really hope all of this really just kind of helps break this down in an easy fashion for you all. If you attempt to make sourdough bread, please share your experience below. I would love to hear. This is also kind of like my first instructional video. Aside from the bagels, I'd say this was a lot more involved. So please feel free to share your comments below. I hope this really helps alleviate some of the pressure and stress surrounding making your own bread. Just please know, do not be too hard on yourself. Go out and try new things, and you never know, you may pick up a new skill that you'll be able to share with your friends and family. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I cannot wait to see you next time. Take care.